Hello everyone, this is Chidanand from Kratz Infotech NG. Welcome to this tutorial on Azure pipelines. In this quick tutorial, what I plan to demonstrate is how to set up an Azure pipeline to talk to a GitHub repository, which consists of a Maven based Java web application. Pretty simple, nothing fancy about it. But then how to put up a pipeline which will pull this code onto Azure, build it, make an artifact out of it, which is a WAR file in this case, and use something called as an Azure extension to go ahead and deploy this WAR file onto a Tomcat server. Now, this Tomcat server is not hosted on Azure. What I plan to do for my demo is host it locally and then expose it out using an utility so that my Tomcat server can be reached from the Azure cloud. Anyone who has a GitHub free account or a personal account can try Azure DevOps pretty much free of cost. Or rather, I wouldn't say try all of them, all of the features. Some features, definitely whatever I'm going to demonstrate in this tutorial can be tried out using your GitHub account. So that's what I've done. I've logged into Azure DevOps using my GitHub account. So I have a repository, I have an organization that I already set up, which is called Anand R72. Inside my organization, I've got a project. All right. So out here, all that I'm interested in is to set up something called as a pipeline. So let me go and click on the pipeline. All right. Now I would want to create a new pipeline. All right. So for those of you who knows continuous integration or the concept of pipelines, one part of it or the beginning of the pipeline always references to a source code repository. So where exactly is my repository? What I want to do for this demo is use one of my GitHub public repositories, which has got a simple Maven based Java code. It's a small web application, nothing fancy out there, but the idea is how beautifully Azure DevOps gives me a kind of ready-made pipeline syntax that understands what is there in this code and can possibly build a pipeline which will pull this code, compile it, package it as well. So let me come back to my Azure DevOps and specify the URL of my code base. All right. So it has got integrations with a lot of things. For me, it is on the GitHub cloud. So this is GitHub. The first time when you click it, Azure DevOps would need some sort of an authorization so that it can reach out to your it can reach out to your GitHub account and grab information. So the first time when you do this, you may need to authorize your Azure DevOps to reach out to GitHub on your account and then pull the repository. So I've already done that, but in case you're trying it for the first time, you'll have to authorize Azure DevOps in order to access your GitHub. All right, so this is my repository. All that I got to type in is MVN. So search for it because all the repositories will show up here. MVN web app. This is the code base. Now it does, it does, checking of what exactly is there in that repository and tells me what kind of a pipeline I may want to put up. Okay, so the top recommendation is it's a Maven based repository because it understands there's a pom.xml out there in my repository. So it pretty much knows that you may want to do this. Okay, so that's what I want to do. I want to set up a pipeline and my code base is typically Maven based. So just click on this. All right, and you would automatically see some sort of a YML. Anyone who's kind of new to Azure repos, but if you have worked on GitHub Actions, in case you haven't, you can take a look at some of my previous tutorials. This YML syntax pretty much closely resembles the GitHub Actions syntax. Okay, so now here it's in simple YML format on what particular branch, master, where will the agent be running? Agent or a kind of, when you talk about continuous integration server, somebody will have to pull the code base and run it. There is a compute required. So this is the automatic compute that is provided by Azure DevOps. And what exactly has to happen? Okay. Again, mind you, I did not choose anything. Automatically, it gave me some parameters. Most of them looks good. Let me just make one modification. Maybe I may want the JDK to be used, the version of the JDK to be used as 1.11. All right. So without doing anything, just by having referencing my GitHub repository, I automatically get a YML file, which prompts me for most of the things, it picks up automatically. And hopefully, if I save it and run it, okay. So setting up CI with Azure Pipeline, this, it's a Git commit sounds good. Okay, commit it directly to the master. Now I hope you understand that I've authorized Azure DevOps to reach out to my GitHub repository. Okay, so when I do the pipeline, a YML will get created. The YML has got this name, Azure-pipelines.yml. In case you want to change it, you can always modify it. But then I will let the defaults take over. So this sounds good. Commit directly to the mastermind. Let me save it and run this pipeline once. Okay, I forgot to mention one other thing. What is the goal? It's going to run an MVN package. Save and run. Okay, sometimes there could be a delay in assigning an agent to this particular job. Sometimes it automatically happens very fast. All right, now if you see, this job is kind of scheduled or it's in a queue. Let me just pause the recording for a minute and come back once this build is complete. In a matter of few minutes, you would notice that the job got completed, and you will find some of these steps that are a kind of a checkpoint for you to validate what happened. All right. So if I go to my Maven and see, it has to pull down all the dependencies, and finally when it built it, I'm more interested in where exactly did the build happen. Okay, so there is a folder, home, vsts, work, and one, and some automatic folder, or a folder which is pre-configured. There's an environment variable using which you can get this particular folder. Under that folder there's a target and ambient web app.war. So this is the name of my artifact that got successfully built. Now, what I want to do in the next step is, now that I have my artifact up there on my Azure DevOps, let me spin up my Tomcat server and let me use an extension. Extension can be viewed like a small plugin, which can be used in order to go ahead and deploy all the way from Azure DevOps onto my Tomcat server, or whatever is your final runtime environment where you would want to go and do the deployment. Now, if I go back to my slide, you would notice that our GitHub is another server which is running on the cloud. My Azure pipeline is running well within the Azure cloud. The source code was pulled in, an artifact was created. Now, the other part is, how do I go and deploy? If it's in Azure deployment, you'll have to use a different kind of an extension and plugin. It's much simpler. Out here, I want to deploy onto a Tomcat server that is natively running somewhere else, assuming it's running on some VM, and the VM should be reachable, or the IP address of, or the fully qualified domain name of this VM should be reachable, by the Azure pipeline, so that they can kind of go ahead and deploy it. If it's well within your own data center, possibly you'll have a way of linking them. But right here for me, Azure pipelines is running on the public cloud, where my Tomcat server is running locally. So I'm going to use a small utility called ngrok to expose my local Tomcat server. Mind you, the last step that I mentioned, where I would want to expose this public to the public IP, is only required in this sort of a case where you're running a server well within your environment, and you'll have to find a way to make that accessible to the public cloud, or anybody who's trying to deploy it from another data center. Otherwise, you don't need to do this part. All right, so let me start up my Tomcat server. I'm a Tomcat Server 8.5. So let me just spin up my Tomcat Server. And this Tomcat Server will run on my local port 8081. So localhost 8081 is where my Tomcat Server is running. And as long as this is running, my Tomcat Server is up. Now this, I have to find a way to expose this out. So I have a small tool called ngrok. I wouldn't recommend that anybody uses this well within your enterprise servers, as only for testing and such sort of a cheeky things you would use this tool. So I use this tool to expose my local host. So I have another prompt where I have an executable downloaded, ngrok http 8081. Okay, so now in a matter of few seconds, I get an URL. Now this URL is a public URL. And this URL internally translates into my local Tomcat server. Now this URL has to be configured because this URL can be reached from Azure DevOps. So my pipelines, when they want to do a deployment, they will reach out to this particular URL. Also, my application will have some sort of an authentication. My Tomcat server has got some sort of an authentication. Now this authentication has also been configured. Okay, so if at all I take a look at Tomcat users.xml, all right, so I've created a user called deployer, a username password based authentication. The username is deployer, password is also deployer, and this user has got script access to manage my Tomcat server, meaning anybody who can use this username and password will be authorized to go ahead and possibly do a deployment on my Tomcat server. So my pipeline is ready. The pipeline is able to build my source code and make a WAR file out of it. My Tomcat server is also up and running. Tomcat server is running locally. It's been exposed using a small tool so that it is reachable from anywhere from the world. So that means my Azure pipeline as an endpoint would be able to reach my Tomcat server. Now Azure pipeline may not understand Tomcat server. So as Azure pipeline would need, or my Azure DevOps would need an extension in the word of Jenkins, something like a plugin, so that my Azure pipeline would be able to deploy onto my Tomcat server. So let me go to my Azure pipeline or my Azure DevOps and then find a suitable extension. All right, so if I go back to my Azure DevOps and my ID. This is my organization. Let me go to my organization settings and no, not here, my bad. Let me go to this marketplace and let me browse a marketplace. Okay, this is where all kinds of extensions are available. So I want an extension which probably will help me deploy to a Tomcat server. So if I search for Tomcat, you will find this doesn't have any rating. This looks like 4.7K. So let me go ahead and install this extension. Okay. So some of them are freely available. Some of them may have a cost associated with this. In case we are not able to find some extension, there must be some other mechanism, some other tools using which you would be able to go ahead and perform the tasks that you've been assigned. All right, so let me install this to this particular organization. All right. Okay, so test DevOps. Let me come back to my pipeline. And what is my pipeline? This was my pipeline. All right, edit this pipeline. Okay, now I have to somehow find, after the build has happened, I'll have to add a small step which will allow the deployment to happen. And this deployment will happen using the extension that I have just now installed. So let me just come down here and possibly I would want a step or a particular task to be performed after the packaging happens. Okay, so what is the task that I would want to do? All right, so this is where I search for Tomcat. Okay, so I hope all of you who have used Jenkins can relate to it. This is like the main job. After the job is done, post job or post deployment kind of an activity. Okay, so deployed to Tomcat server. Okay, so what is the URL of your Tomcat server? So my Tomcat or my public URL is this URL. Let me just check it again, because sometimes this tool gives me problems. Okay, yeah, this URL is good. All right, this is the URL. And what is my username? Username is deployer. That's for my configuration. Password is also called deployer. Okay, now where is the war file present? Where is the war file present? That's very important. So I can either give the complete path of it, or I can give a relative path saying target mbn webapp.war. Okay, and application context. Now we're going to go to deploy it out to Tomcat. In which particular folder do you want this deployment to happen? Okay, I would call it Azure deploy, any name that you would want. Okay, Tomcat Server 7 and above. Yeah, this looks good. Okay, add. Okay, now this set of YML syntax that has been put up will ensure that after the build happens, the packaging happens, the deployment, it will try to do a deployment based upon the URL, the username, password, and what is the location of my war file, and what is the context in which the deployment needs to happen. Okay, so let me save this. Now again, when I save this, this goes as a YML addition, an update to the YML. So I'm okay to go ahead and directly commit this into the master branch. So let me go ahead and save it. Now let me come back to my pipelines, and this is my pipeline. All right, the second set of the second pipeline which will run, just because I added another task and I made some changes to the YML. So another pipeline will get triggered, and if everything goes well, let me go to my Tomcat server, web apps folder. Okay, out here, you should notice the war file deployment happening. Okay, so let me wait for the job to get over. Okay, still the maven is running. All the dependencies are getting downloaded. All right, so it went ahead and tried to do deployment. Looks like everything happened well. You see here, azure-deploy.war. Okay, azure-deploy is my context in which I requested Azure pipeline to go and deploy. So if at all I go to my Tomcat server and / azure-deploy, okay, as simple as that. I hope you found my tutorial useful, and I hope you figured out how easy it is to connect your Azure pipelines onto a GitHub repository, and also use an extension to go ahead and perform a deployment outside your Azure cloud. Thank you so much for stopping by, and if anybody wants to try this out, I will leave all the documentation regarding the source code that I referenced in the description section of my tutorial. Please try it out, and in case you run into any issues, kindly leave a message and I'll try to address it as soon as I can. Thank you so much. You guys have a great